Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Michael Tremblay.
And I'm Caleb Ontiveros.
And today we'll be talking about Stoic gatekeeping, or maybe more accurately, gatekeeping who is or who is not a Stoic. I wanted to talk about this. We don't talk about it too much on our podcast, Caleb, but we have a newsletter, the Stoa Letter. I've wrote a recent piece in that letter on this topic, and I want to discuss the same themes from the letter today. Go over some of those arguments and get your view on it. I was inspired to talk about this topic. It's one I've been thinking about a lot. This idea of these kind of debates about, well, this person's a Stoic, this person's not. You know, is Ryan Holiday a Stoic? Is Cicero a Stoic? Is Marcus Aurelius a Stoic? Is modern Stoicism even possible? When you're on Facebook, Reddit, Discord, these arguments come up all the time. These discussions come up all the time. And I was sparked in particular by a recent Substack post from Laura Kennedy, who it's called, "Is Stoicism Just Self-Help for Men Now?" And she basically argues that the modern Stoicism movement deviates from a lot of core commitments of ancient Stoicism. And in her words, quote, "The result is incoherence. Modern Stoicism is attempting to achieve something that ancient Stoicism was designed to resist." So the kind of threat she's posing is that modern Stoics, or the argument is that modern Stoics are not Stoics, and not just not being Stoics. You can't just call them Stoic version 2. The modern Stoic movement is actually philosophically incoherent. It is opposite to Stoicism. It is extremely deviant from what the Stoics prescribed. And maybe we'll have a part 2 to this podcast. We talked about this before. We're like, there's no way we can fit both of talking about Laura's arguments and gatekeeping in here. But it really got me thinking about this gatekeeping question, and why does it rub me the wrong way sometimes? Like I both care about high standards, and I care about what the Stoics thought. Obviously, I spent so much time reading about it and thinking about it. But then sometimes these kind of articles or these kinds of arguments also rub me the wrong way, and they seem not productive. And so I wanted to sit down and think about this idea of gatekeeping who really is a Stoic, and what are some of the pros of doing that? What are some of the reasons for it? And then what are some of the mistakes or some of the ways that can go wrong? That's what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, it's a good topic, and there's a lot to talk about here. And I think it's something that's both related to, how do you interact with other Stoics, either in person or online? How do you categorize people as Stoic? But also when it comes to yourself, I suppose, there's that question, am I a Stoic? And that touches on some of these questions about, what are the sufficient conditions for being a Stoic? And I've certainly met people who listen to this podcast or use the Stoa app and say things like, I couldn't call myself a Stoic, and then they'll go on to say all these things that make them sound a lot like a Stoic. And on the other hand, also met people who had claimed that they're Stoics without, while either behaving or saying things that don't sound particularly Stoic to me. So I think it comes up both in the social context around, determining who is a Stoic, what does it take to claim to be a Stoic, but also when it comes to yourself and your own identity, to what extent are you a Stoic, or Michael or I? So yeah, it's a great topic. And I think, what we're sort of thinking about is there's how strict should we be with that question? And what are sorts of the goods? What are the pros and cons for being more or less strict?
Yeah, exactly.
So, and you put together a list of those that we'll go through. I think listeners should definitely check out the article also for part 2, which touches on, this is specific reasons Laura Kennedy thinks modern Stoics are not Stoics, and perhaps we'll touch on that on a later episode as well, because I think we both have lots of thoughts on that issue. But today we're talking about, when you're thinking about gatekeeping others or thinking about the question yourself, whether you are a Stoic, how should you think about that?
Yeah. And trying to thread, like anything else, trying to thread the right balance, not giving up standards, not, hey, if Jimmy wants to call himself a Stoic, what's the harm? Let him, this just doesn't mean anything. Just let him do whatever he wants. And then you got on that on one end, and then on the other end, was Epictetus really a Stoic? Because he mentions, I see sometimes that like Seneca mentions crying or something at some point. And so Seneca's not a Stoic because, and I get to I'm like, wow, that's a pretty high standard. Like we're holding things to a pretty high standard at that point. Before we get into this deeper, I want to talk about, I pulled this from Facebook, but someone on the Living Stoicism Facebook group, Alex Capernaz, I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, but he posted this thing called the Stoicism Alignment Chart, which I thought gave this like nice framework for how lenient or strict you can be. And it divides Stoics in two aspects. One is kind of theory, and the other is historical context. So you imagine it like an alignment chart, like a D&D character. And so in the top left-hand corner, you have someone who is a theory purist. They think you're only a Stoic if you adhere to Stoic orthodoxy in all or most respects, and a historical purist. So you must be from the time and place where Stoicism was from. And so someone who's a theory purist and a historical purist would think only Zeno, only Chrysippus are Stoics. Maybe not even, maybe Marcus, maybe Seneca, but even then you're getting some Roman influence in there. And then, you can move away to the bottom right-hand corner, which is a theory rebel and historical rebel, which is, they don't need to ascribe exactly to Stoicism as long as they get the vibes right. And they don't need to have any sort of kind of historical or cultural connection to the movement at all. I think myself, it's an interesting question. Not exactly the question of this podcast. An interesting question where we fall on that chart. We're interested where you fall on that chart, Caleb. I'm probably somewhere between a theory purist and a theory neutral. According to this chart, like I think you need to. There's some core parts of Stoicism you need to adhere to be a Stoic. But my list of what those core things are, might be a bit smaller than other people. And then I'm definitely historically neutral. I think anybody in any period of time can be a Stoic as long as they believe and are practicing the philosophy. That's probably where I land. Do you have any? Do you have an initial sense before we get into the pros and cons of thinking about things this way?
Oh yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely an interesting framing. I think I would be probably pretty similar to you, where I wouldn't call Cicero a Stoic. So in that sense, I would be closer to a theory purist, perhaps. But and the historical question is interesting. I do think there are some interesting challenges about to what extent you can capture your following. I would say, maybe I put it this way. I would say that I'm ultimately historically neutral when it comes to, calling someone a Stoic today or not. But it is plausible to me that the tradition is just so different from what it was hundreds of years ago that shouldn't be underrated or missed. And I think there's probably similar issues when you think about religious practice as well. Like who's a Christian today? Is it really, of course, Christianity has changed over the centuries. And even if there's some core that's remained consistent, it would be a mistake to overlook that. So the same is probably true for Stoicism.
I like that idea. I think what I'm getting from what you're saying is that you're a theory purist or somewhere in that theory purist bucket, and then historically neutral, but you doubt there's questions about our capacity to be theory pure when we're so far removed from the life and time and context of these thinkers. Is that your point? Like we just don't think about the world the same way a Greek or a Roman does?
Yeah, I think so. We don't think about the world the same way as Greeks or Romans, and our context is sufficiently different to make sure that there is a radical gap. Perhaps people can go too far, but there's always this. It's almost a paradox, I think, when you read about ancient lives. Once the past is an alien country, and at the same time, everyone seems the same. They have the same worries about their status, same loves, pleasures, but then they'll say something completely out of the blue that makes you realize that they think completely differently than you do. Mm-hmm. So I maybe I'm not solving that paradox, but I do think we should acknowledge that it's there.
Yeah. And then I might think of like maybe we have like a Ryan Holiday, that you're in like a theory neutral where I think generally gets the thrusts of things. I mean, when you're talking about Ryan Holiday, you probably have to look over the course of his career too, as I think he's like learned a lot more about Stoicism as he's went. But maybe if you think about an early book like The Obstacle is the Way or Ego is the Enemy, you're kind of getting the general thrust of the theory right, but maybe not all aspects of it exactly correct. And then I think maybe like the theory rebel is somebody who just, they don't show a lot of emotion, or you think of like a Broicism, as we talk about now, somebody who thinks Stoicism is just, um, not showing or expressing your emotion, that we call that person Stoic. And there's only this kind of tangential relationship with the historical practice. Anyway, I think it's an interesting thought experiment. It's in my Substack article if you want to look at the framework. But now to some of the pros and cons of having these kinds of conversations. You might think, what's the point of this? And I want to start with some of the pros, because I'm gonna get critical in a second, but I do think there is a pro to it. The first pro, so just so we're specific what we're talking about, I see this all the time. Someone argues Ryan Holiday isn't a Stoic, for example, and somebody else comes on and goes, hey, Ryan Holiday's done more for popularizing Stoicism than you ever will. Why are you calling him not a Stoic? Why are you criticizing him? And this is the kind of exercise we're talking about, or someone comes on and says modern Stoics aren't real Stoics. Someone says, hey, these are people trying to improve their lives. Why are you coming in and why are you criticizing that process? Just like let them try to be better people, leave them alone. And so what are some of the actual pros of doing this? I'm going to start with that. The first pro of gatekeeping Stoicism is just that it maintains a high standard in the pursuit of truth. So I have a PhD in Stoicism, as you know, and then I think about, we see gatekeeping in academia all the time. Like I had a PhD examination. People don't automatically pass PhD examinations. Like that's the point of having one. They bring in an external examiner who's from a different institution just to limit the amount of bias. So if you produce something bad, that person's supposed to, their role is to be like, I don't know, you guys are friends or something, but this is like not good. We're not letting this pass. And the function of that is basically to maintain a high standard, to make sure that people that call themselves PhDs signal a certain amount of legitimacy or a certain amount of skill in the field. And so the gatekeeping Stoicism, I think, has the same function. When someone says you're not being Stoic right now, or that person is a Stoic, they're kind of signaling either an exemplar or somebody who's living up to the ideals, or they're signaling that you're not an exemplar and you're failing to live up to those ideals. And I know when I probably still encounter this, but especially when I was learning, it's helpful for people to tell you that your view is not Stoic. It's helpful for people to tell you that your interpretation isn't accurate, that it contradicts passages or books you haven't read before, that your understanding is flawed and it sounds more like Epicureanism or Buddhism than Stoicism. These are helpful things if you're in the pursuit of truth and you want to really understand what Stoicism is, because Stoicism is about the pursuit of truth. So if you call yourself a Stoic, you want to make sure, which is about living a life that's in accordance with the nature of things and about achieving knowledge, you want to make sure you understand what that means and what that commits you to. And it's helpful for other people to point that out or to hold that to a high standard.
I do think the argument is really very simple, but it is a good one. Just that, even from the Stoic perspective, you're ultimately concerned with knowledge to the extent that it can be obtained. So of course, if you are going to call yourself or others Stoic, you want to be accurate in that description, in that claim. So then I think there is perhaps a question, how loose or tight should one be with that definition? I think it's fairly clear that there's at least some, common standards of continuity or dogma with the original Stoic schools that we see, and some key claims that, you can't call yourself a Stoic if you're disagreeing with the Stoics' rivals, or, claiming that indifference can trump the value of virtue or something of that nature if you have a completely different ethical system. So in a way, this is, I think, a common sense claim and a good argument that we accept in other domains when it comes to a PhD. I think in your article you mentioned jujitsu and having a standards that, you can't just give yourself a black belt or what have you.
Yeah, you can go buy a black belt on Amazon the same way you can call yourself a Stoic. It like doesn't make it true. Is the
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, and then that gets. I mean, the point you were raising, it gets to my second point, which is that defining Stoicism and saying that is not Stoic forces you to think very philosophically, very carefully about what the essential commitments of Stoicism are. Like you, as you were just saying, well, you can't be a Stoic and disagree with the essential commitments. And it's almost then like when we talk about theory purist versus the theory rebel, the difference there is about how the list and the in I guess extent and intensity of the theoretical commitments that must be passed to earn that title. Somebody might just say, well, you don't cry at a funeral, you're Stoic. And then somebody might say, well, you've got to completely adhere to the Stoic conception of physics, ethics, and epistemology as written by Zeno. And so in order to even do the practice of gatekeeping, you need to think really carefully about what the Stoics actually thought, and then which of those thoughts or arguments are essential to the system, which is a really fun, helpful philosophical exercise. I think it really helps clarify your thinking on these topics. And in the article, I talk about an idea by James Daltrey, which is the Stoic trident, which is this idea that whenever we're talking about Stoicism, there's three different things going on. There's what the Stoics think. There's like descriptively the Stoic arguments. There's what we think about the Stoics' thought. So do we think that's a stupid argument or a good argument? Do we think it's a good argument, weakly argued? And three, what do we think regardless of the Stoics? So do we have a view that is entirely different than the Stoics? And those things often get conflated in conversation. I see a lot of the times people try to adopt their, or they like Stoicism, they find it intuitive, they think it's a good label, and they start to add their own ethical intuitions onto Stoicism, like this idea of free will. I see a lot of people just assuming the Stoics endorse free will, or like a non-deterministic universe, I should say more concretely. And that's just like not the case. That's just not what they say. If you look at what they say anywhere. But I think people are thinking about what they think and trying to fit it into the Stoic system, where the gatekeeping exercise is almost the opposite direction. It's almost, I've got to be really clear and careful about what the Stoics thought, and then I can see how that fits up to what do I think about that, and then how does that fit against what I think ethically about living well, or about the nature of God or free will or the universe in other ways. Basically, that's a long-winded way of saying I think it's really helpful to try to think about what the essential aspects of any philosophy or way of thought are. And gatekeeping requires you to do that. And essentially, when you debate other people about it, it's a philosophical debate about those essential qualities. And I think that's just intellectually helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just that exercise of thinking what are the core commitments of the Stoics. And of course, that's a theoretical discussion, but it's also a discussion about, life philosophy. We know what the Stoics think was ultimately meaningful. And their beliefs, the way they thought, of course, influenced their decisions. So if you're maybe a little skeptical of the discussion, thinking this is mostly a theoretical matter, I think there's still that argument that their views, whether especially about their ethical views, what's valuable, did matter for how they behave, for the decisions they made, quite often. So I think there's that line of thought as well.
I mean, this comes out in the piece by Laura Kennedy. If you think not pursuing any sort of external success is an essential component of being a Stoic, then that has significant implications for how you live and how you choose to structure your life. If you don't think helping your neighbor, having connections to your family, caring about justice as a virtue, if you don't think of that as an essential part of Stoicism, then that's going to very much influence the way that you act and treat people, even when trying to be a Stoic. So, great point. It's not just the theoretical argument, even though as much as I like those, it forces you as a practitioner to say which things do I have to do, and or, because I don't think you have to do everything perfectly to call yourself a Stoic, which things should I be aiming to do long term? Which skills should I be aiming to develop long term? I don't think you're not a Stoic if you struggle with desire over, food or any sort of external like that. But you would think if you were trying to be a Stoic, you would say, well, that's something that I have to kind of overcome or focus on in the long term. As I continue to practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And then the third benefit. So first benefit is like we want to have standards, and that's helpful when pursuing the truth. Can't just call anything. Second argument is that it forces you to find what's essential about Stoicism. The third benefit of gatekeeping is that as practitioners, it can have a motivating effect. It can be encouraging. And so example I use is that Epictetus, he used to mock his students, and he would ask them to show him a single Stoic. He would say, quote, observe your own behavior in this way, and you'll find out what school you belong to. You'll find that most of you are Epicureans, and some few are peripatetics, but pretty feeble ones at that. For by what action do you prove that you think virtue equal and even superior to all other things? Show me a Stoic if you have one. Where or how? You can show indeed 1,000 who can repeat the Stoic quibbles, but do they repeat the Epicurean ones less well? And so this is Stoic gatekeeping at its best, right? Epictetus is saying, you claim to be Stoics, but when I look at you, I see Epicureans and Aristotelians. And it's almost a two-part challenge. One part is like, live up to the title you're giving yourself, live up to the high standard you've set for yourself. And then I think the other challenge is just like, which I do a lot to people, is like, if you don't agree with Stoicism, leave. If you don't you don't have to call yourself a Stoic. If you don't agree with Stoicism, if you're more of an Aristotelian or you're more of an Epicurean, call yourself that. Like, be consistent with how you live and how you call yourself. And that will help a lot of people too, because I don't expect everybody listening to this podcast to be a Stoic. It's not necessary, but you would want everybody listening, myself included, to try to be consistent. And if you find yourself not meshing with a part of the philosophy, it's either like you need to hold yourself to a higher standard, or you don't have to fully ascribe to the philosophy either, but just make sure you're clear on which parts you are ascribing to and which you aren't.
Yeah, I love that quote from Epictetus. I do find it motivating. There's a sense in which I think another complication that comes into this debate, or complication, but if you think about the term and why some people might be uncomfortable calling themselves a Stoic, is that in a way it's an aspirational term. They might say, I aim to believe like a Stoic or aim to act like a Stoic, but I'm not there yet. And I think to the extent that's true, if you paint the Stoic as if you paint them as someone worth emulating, someone with high standards, both in action and thought, then you might be a little bit closer to the gatekeeping side, even though maybe you think it's something to aspire to, something you're trying to, a model you're trying to get closer to. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, I love that. We had the gatekeeping matrix, the 3x3 alignment chart. You're saying it's a gatekeeping cube, basically, where you've got your historical, you've got your theoretical commitments, and then you've got your practice. So like, are you a Stoic if you say you believe what the Stoic thoughts, but you don't act like it? And you're basically introducing this third dimension. And so, and this is maybe what Epictetus is saying, you all tell me you all believe what the Stoics say, but when I look at your actions, I don't see it. And so the Stoic is the person who believes the Stoic things, but also acts in a Stoic way, or, in the Stoic view, claims to believe, because you couldn't not act that way if you believed it, really, truly had internalized it. I like that idea. Makes you a more harsh gatekeeper if you introduce that kind of third practice dimension. And then I think the other thing you hit on is, I think, a really clear view. I sometimes call myself a philosopher and people will scoff at that. It's just like, some things just seem weird to say. It's like it is. Does trying to be a Stoic? This is probably the single biggest divide. Does trying to be a Stoic make you a Stoic, or like does aligning yourself to that practice qualify you, or is it only when you kind of achieve a certain level of that practice? I'm probably pretty low on the practice scale. I think practice is probably pretty low because I think it's just more meaningful to say you're a good Stoic or a bad Stoic. Like I come from the martial arts background where I would say, yeah, if you do 3 weeks of jiu-jitsu, you're a jiu-jitsu guy. You just suck. But I'm not gonna say you're not a jiu-jitsu fighter until you get your black belt. I think excluding that it's again, Stoic doesn't mean master. They had a term for master. It was the sage. The Stoic just means, for me at least, the Stoic just means the person that puts themselves on that journey. Although maybe you could debate Epictetus doesn't agree, which is why he's using this kind of language.
Yeah, I think that's a good or a clear position. It's sort of like, we'll let you in the Stoic door, but that doesn't mean we're going to call you a good Stoic.
Yeah.
That's where everything begins, as it were.
Cool. Anything else on the benefits of gatekeeping?
I would say there's almost a social benefit to gatekeeping that's related to these arguments, which is that it maintains the character of a social group more tightly. And it's just a sort of a fact of the matter that, in order to tend a garden well, you need to take out the weeds. You can't plant whatever you want. And there's a sort of a social element to this, which is if you want to maintain a culture, of course, you need to define the culture that you want to maintain and only let in people, as it were, who show the sign that they will maintain, what's essential to the culture, which of course is consistent with some amount of evolution, but that's I think that social element shouldn't be overlooked. It's present in some of the metaphors we use, but I think it's worth stating explicitly as well.
And you take that as a benefit? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a benefit. If you think about that if you think about other analogies of, this is what we want to do with our company, and we want to make sure people subscribe to the general values. That's a maybe important process of hiring. And I think there's sort of a similar, but much larger, more diffuse effect you see with ideologies generally, where, if it doesn't take much to claim that you're a Christian or something of this sort, then of course you're going to get divisions, different kinds of Christianity. Of course, other Christians will think maybe there are some tents that are too big or something of this sort, where they cease to become Christian at all. Perhaps universalists are an example of this. But I do think there's something to that argument. And perhaps this becomes a bit of a rant at this point, but in a way, if you of course, if you're very tolerant of determining who gets to be a Christian or not, then you've already made a division between other kinds of Christians and yourself. And perhaps we see that with Stoicism to some extent. Different kinds of modern Stoics, traditional Stoics, people who just ingest a little bit of the content and such and start to call themselves Stoics. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, one of our first episodes was the 6 kinds of Stoicism, where we talk about these groups that have kind of like self-formed or been divided up. Yep, great. So I'm going to move on to the risks of gatekeeping Stoicism. And so these are what I see as the downsides. The first one is that it can make people pedantic and too theoretical. So Stoicism, it's about achieving knowledge, but knowledge is best demonstrated through action, not through philosophical debate. I have a quote here from Epictetus, where Epictetus says, "The philosophers therefore first exercise us in theory, which is the easier task, and then lead us to the more difficult. For in theory, there is nothing to oppose our following what we are taught, but in life there are many things to distract us." And so the view there is you need to learn the theory, then you need to put it into practice. And putting it into practice is harder by definition. Well, maybe not by definition, but by the Stoics' definition. And so I worry when you stay in the land of defining Stoicism too much, you stay in the theoretical land, and you can get very precise. You can have a lot of authority. You can think very carefully about these things without having to transition to the other land, which is the doing land. And so being the best at describing the Stoic virtue of justice and which behaviors count as it and which don't, and what are the sub virtues. It's not the same thing as being the kindest friend in practice. And to me, being courageous in the face of evil is more Stoic than someone who has published on Stoic ethics. I think in many ways we hit on this in our earlier part of this conversation, where there's just this division between the theoretical and the practical. And you could gatekeep in terms of the practical, but maybe it's just the result of being online. Nobody knows each other. We're all just publishing these articles or talking to each other. We're then gatekeeping in terms of we're often gatekeeping in terms of the theory, in terms of the beliefs and the arguments. And I just think there's a danger there to feel like, I talked before, but there's a value of defining the necessary qualities of Stoicism. There is a value to that. That's not the end of Stoicism. And so like staying in that world too long, I think, is dangerous for the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I think so. And perhaps to make that more concrete, it sometimes seems like arguments about whether Stoics should be theists or not, whether they should believe in providence, sort of enter into this domain where it's not clear that, if you don't believe in providence, but you still believe in virtue, like the classical Stoics, still believe in some of the essential claims of Stoic ethics and logic, it's not clear to me that, you would act differently. You would even think significantly differently from Stoics who do, in fact, see providence as a fundamental fact of reality. So that often I think that debate can get, although it's important, it does seem like it can lean, has that risk where it can lean to be too theoretical. I do think it's important for Stoics to know what the classical Stoic beliefs about nature, God, providence, and such were, and that we're thinking through. But it's not clear to me that as Stoics today, that should serve as a necessary bar one has to hop over, belief in God and providence, so long as you have some of these other essential beliefs about Stoic ethics and logic and can ground them in a philosophically plausible story, even if philosophical debate's going to remain, I'm sure.
Yeah, we're kind of refining our thinking as we go here, or at least I feel like I'm refining my thinking. We've made this divide between the theoretical and the practice, and we've identified that some theoretical definitions end up making a great deal of difference for your practice. Understanding and believing, following the virtues of the Stoic virtues will make a great difference to how you live. Thinking that you won't be happy by pursuing externals and that happiness comes down to virtue makes a great deal of difference in how you practice and live. Understanding Stoic epistemology, that your first impression of the situation is not necessarily the right impression, and that you need to be careful about what the truth of the matter is, because it's dangerous to live with false beliefs. That will make a great deal of difference in how you live. But it's not clear to me the Stoic physics, this idea of, whether or not there are atoms or whether or not there is no division between things. That if you want to start saying, you're not a Stoic if you believe in atoms, it starts to feel pedantic and theoretical. And it's like, well, why is that the case? Unless you want to be the most kind of extreme Stoic purist possible. And it strikes me that that's the case, because that's the kind of thing that, as you said, it's an even more extreme example, but it's the kind of thing, as you said, where it's not clear how that has a great deal of difference on how we would live or how we would feel. Now, the purist counter argument to this would be, well, the ethics all flow from that. But there might be other ways to recover and save the ethics. So that was a long way of me saying, I think I'm agreeing with you. And I think it's coming down to this. Let's be pretty theoretical, pedantic, and precise about, pedantic's not the right word, but precise about things that matter to how we live and act in accordance with the Stoic ethical lens. But maybe we can have a little bit more flexibility around the things that don't have a big impact there. You know, like Epictetus's comments about like, you'll have to kill me before I shave my beard. And like, it's one of those things where you're just like, I don't know if I need to, you know, I don't know if that's one I'm going to take with me or not.
Yeah. That line is specific. I suppose there's a way of reading that as saying you have to kill me before I deny I'm a philosopher. When that's the mark of a philosopher, but I think that is true that the of course there are many contingent beliefs. That's a contingent fact.
Lots of shaved philosophers now. Yeah.
Yeah. For better or worse.
Cool. And then the other counter. So one risk is it makes us too theoretical, keeps us in the land of theory. We feel like we're learning about Stoicism and getting better, but we're just splitting hairs. The other is that it can actually get us further away from the truth. And so we want to gatekeep because we want to define what does or does not qualify as Stoicism. But there's always going to be some fuzziness around this. Stoicism's evolved, it's changed. Chrysippus refined Zeno's work. Epictetus pushed his students to apply Chrysippus's work in their own novel ways. And, you know, are you going to get to the level where you say, well, I'm a Zenonian. I don't believe in that Chryssippian, you know, deviation from the original thinking. Like, are you going to get to this level of precision? When we do that, we sort of miss the forest for the trees. And there's some fuzziness about what Stoicism means, but if your definition gets too precise, you've probably gone wrong somewhere. You've probably, in the pursuit of specificity and being exact, actually missed some things or excluded some things. And basically, I think you've gone too far. I write in the piece a longer old joke, but I mean, I'll try to summarize it quickly here. But it's the one where, you know, a man's walking by and he sees someone about to jump off the bridge and he says, "Don't do it." You know, "Are you a Christian?" And he's like, "Yes, we've got this connection." And then he asks him, "Are you Protestant or Catholic?" "Protestant, me too." And they kind of go through and they find all these similarities. And then at the very end, the person reveals himself to be like a slightly different version of a Protestant than the other man. And he pushes him off the bridge and says, "Die, heretic." And I always think about that. I think about that joke a lot. Because, you know, these gatekeeping problems, they're not unique to Stoicism. Obviously, religion's been encountering them for a long time. And I think when we're gatekeeping, we should be holding each other to high standards. We should be reminding each other about philosophical coherence and the implications that you can't throw out this part of Stoicism and keep this other part because they rely on each other. But we shouldn't be trying to find the heretic. We shouldn't be trying to make our in-group as small as possible, as if that gives us something. I just don't think it does.
Yeah, so I think, I suppose there's sort of a temptation or a vice that's close to gatekeeping, which is that you end up being focused on the wrong thing. And I suppose it's the balance that we began with. You don't want to be both strict gatekeeping and loose gatekeeping can be a vice in their own way. Logical vices. And this is the side of gatekeeping too much, of course.
Yeah, like any good question, the answer becomes it depends. It's like a craft in a way. We want to do it because we want to preserve truth. You know, at its best, it's theoretically and practically helpful. Because it's theoretically helpful because it makes you really think deeply about what Stoicism is. It makes you understand what the Stoics thought separate from your own intuitions and beliefs. And it motivates you. It holds you to a high standard. It tells you which beliefs are essential, which actions need to be a part of your practice if you want to be Stoic. And then at its worst, it's theoretically and practically unhelpful. It's theoretically unhelpful because it gets us too small of a standard, or it like distorts the truth as we start to become as specific as possible and say, well, only this one person was ever Stoic, which I think you're just missing the mark there. Or it's practically unhelpful because it keeps you in kind of this land of definition, refinement, debate. And that's fine if you're an academic philosopher. Those people stay in that land all day long. And I think that's a perfect question to write your PhD thesis on. What are the essential theoretical commitments of Stoicism? Who qualifies in ancient history as a Stoic or not Stoic? Wonderful theoretical question for an academic. Has its limits as a practitioner. And then I suppose one thing we didn't talk about here, there's also just this kind of like antisocial aspect to it. Like you can be demotivating to others as well. Like there's a difference between you holding yourself to a high standard of what's Stoic and not Stoic, and you going around policing. And I tend to be like a little skeptical of policing if somebody didn't ask for your advice, or didn't ask for your feedback. But maybe that's, I don't know. What do you think about that? Maybe you're a little bit more intense or a little bit more comfortable with doing that than I am. What do you think?
Yeah. So in a way, it sort of depends on the cultural, maybe perhaps the social context and what you're trying to do within your current group. I mean, I've certainly seen interactions in general Stoic groups where someone's clearly excited about something about Stoicism, but might say something slightly off, and then they get critiqued for it. And
yeah, I hate that.
That seems like a mistake. You know, they were excited about Ryan Holiday's book and made a post about how cool Stoicism is, and then someone just says, Ryan Holiday's not a Stoic. End of comment. And like, well, great. So there is perhaps, I think, especially in general groups, that kind of attitude it just is positively antisocial.
Well, which is a different question from, is Ryan Holiday a Stoic? Where I think in that case, it's totally fine to respond to that and say no. You know, it's just like a different kind of thing going on, as you're pointing out, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I do think there is some value to that being said. Like, yeah, I think there's just a different way of saying that, or even arguing for that view, whether that's important. In a sense, I think a lot of general Stoic chats, that's really not almost a place not to gatekeep. It's in smaller groups where, you know, people it's clear that they're not just someone saying they stumbled across a book or a video and they're excited about Stoicism, but maybe they're starting to get a little bit more engaged and have a view about what Stoicism is. And I think that the conversations with those kinds of people might involve more gatekeeping, as it were. I mean, it's similar to an experience that I'm sure something that you've got more thoughts on, but I was just thinking about how if you let someone into a gym, you're not right off the bat going to give them, whether it's exercise or martial arts, what have you, all these requirements for being a member of that gym or for exercising well, apart from some really basic matters of etiquette. But as they want to level up, then that's when you might be a little harder on them. Right. So I do wonder if there's something to this general model. Yeah,
it's a good point. I mean, maybe it's a good point because you agreed with me with my view earlier, so I'm agreeing back with you. That maybe the most pro-social way is to have like low standards at the start that get progressively higher as you progress. And that's kind of like the student-teacher model or the skill development model. Maybe some flexibility in that claim. You know, you're not yelling at 6-year-olds that they're not real soccer players because they're like, you know, messing up the drills or something. It's like you let people kind of, where you might, you think of that music snob who says that someone's not a real bass player until they can play this piece, or they're not a real guitarist until they can play this piece. It's not doesn't have the social benefit. I don't know. It rubs me the wrong way. I think that's fine for me to say. It bugs me. I don't like it. And I don't like it because I teach a lot of beginners things, especially in jiu-jitsu, also in philosophy. And I think what's best to do is kind of encourage their intuitions, promote their interest, and do that in a way that builds the energy, as you said. Like, oh, they're excited about Stoicism. I just read this really cool book. Build on that energy, kind of yes and it. And not kind of squash it or redirect it or squash it or diminish it if it doesn't, precisely land. But
yeah, I think so. I wonder if sometimes, I think that's pretty close to how I think about this. And I wonder if sometimes myself or, perhaps you as well say things that on surface might seem inconsistent, but in part is just trying to do our best to play between the fact that we speak to people who practically something about Stoicism has made a large difference to their lives, and they're not, say, as they haven't spent as much time reading Stoics, modern works, what have you, as we have, and perhaps they're not even inclined to read that much at all. And but they've discovered Stoicism through some Alcoholics Anonymous group, and it's made a huge difference to their lives. And I think that's one group of people who we speak to, and we want to serve well. But at the same time, we're also talking to people who maybe study philosophy. It's very important to have high existential or epistemic standards. They have an analytical personality that resonates with them, and pushing forward what modern Stoicism is theoretically is important to them, as it's important to us. So, and I think that perhaps fits in with generally thinking about Stoicism as a matter of building skills, and broadly both in the practical and the theoretical dimensions, to the extent that those can be split. And I think there's not just one skill hierarchy, as it were, that we're trying to speak to.
Yeah, great. I think that's a good point. I mean, it just comes back to there's a time and a place. Make sure the time and a place in an audience. Make sure you're keeping that in mind. Leaning into the benefits and trying to avoid some of the weaknesses. And so I'll do a quick review on that. I think benefits of gatekeeping: maintains high standards of truth, forces us to think deeply about the essential qualities of Stoicism, and it can be motivating as practitioners. Some of its risks is that it can make you too theoretical, too pedantic. You're focused on minute details instead of practice. And it can get you further away from the truth if you're too restrictive or too overly confident in your definition. So I think we want good gatekeeping. It supports effective practice by preserving truth and high standards, but it avoids unhelpfully narrow definitions or focus on the theoretical. And that's a balance. That's just getting the balance right. And that takes practice, which might be a little bit unsatisfying as a conclusion, but like most things, just the answer depends. And it's a bit of a skill in of itself, as you were saying.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're trying to be at once pro-social and logically rigorous at the same time. And I think that's what we're trying to do. And to the extent that we're not meeting either of those goals, we're happy to take criticism or gatekeeping, as it were. So
yeah.
Do let us know your thoughts on that.
Like I was saying, we're gatekeeping right now. So we're telling you how to. No, you don't gatekeep like that. You gatekeep like this. This is how the real gatekeepers gatekeep. So thanks for that. That's the value of this. Great. Anything else you wanted to add?
No. I should say, do check out the rest of Michael's article. I think it's, we didn't touch on it all, but part 2 clears out some common misunderstandings with Stoicism, I thought, very nicely. So do check out the Stoa letter if you haven't already. And thanks for putting this together, Michael.
Awesome. Thank you.
Peace. Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. If you found this conversation useful, please give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you use, and share it with a friend. And I'd like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. Do check out his work at ancientlyre.com, and please get in touch with us at stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback or questions. Until next time.